Hey everyone, Charlie here. I'm jumping into a topic that I didn't really think I'd cover this soon, but it seems like with the events of this week, with so many people predicting the rapture happening this week, it's late September 2025. If you're watching this video much later, this became literally a TikTok trend. I wanted to address, are we supposed to look for signs and predict the coming of Jesus? If you're looking for a quick answer to this question, it is no. Take it from somebody that's been studying the Bible for over 30 years. We are not necessarily supposed to look for these signs, and we're going to get into this and the nitty-gritty of it, of Jesus coming back. Do I think Jesus is coming back? Absolutely. Will we know when it's happening? Absolutely not. And so the folks that really love to point to this sign, these earthquakes, these famines, these wars, this political intrigue that seems to match this thing in Revelation, they are practicing a tradition that's really only been popular for about the last 100 years. Most of the Catholic, Orthodox, Reformed Church does not look for these sorts of things to happen, right? So I just want to be really clear that most of the church, I believe, although very popular in the American church and the evangelical church, is sort of this position that we should be looking for signs of the tribulation, signs of the rapture. But if you just want a quick punchline answer from me to you on that question, no. Is Jesus coming back? Yes. Will there be signs for that? No. And I'll show you that specifically in 3 of the Gospels that it talks about it, and some other places as well. We'll go to Matthew 24 and a little bit in 25. We'll even go back to Matthew 23 for a second, Luke 21, and Mark 13. Okay, the only preface before I get into the scripture here and just dive into Matthew 24 to show you some very important verses is that many times in the Bible, God says, hey, I'm going to come and do this thing, right? I'm going to come and bless Israel. I'm going to come and judge Israel. I'm going to come in the form of this leader, this nation. And you don't necessarily see God physically coming and doing these things, right? Even God says, I'm going to come punish Israel. And he does that with the Assyrians and Babylons kind of late in their history in the Old Testament. And then he says, I'm going to punish these nations now, right? That were overly cruel to Israel, above and beyond what I allow. And then he came in the form of later nations, the Persians and the Romans. And so many times God in the Bible, and this is the only preface I want to give you because it will explain some of the things we're going to look at. God says, I'm going to come do a thing. And then he does through a foreign leader, foreign nation, or even sometimes through Israel themselves. He will come and he'll do these things, right? Because this is important and you'll understand why in just a second. All right, Jesus, towards the end of his ministry, he is walking by the temple and they say, boys in the temple cool. Sorry, I'm going to paraphrase. And he says, it's going to be torn down, right? You'll see the same passage in Mark 13 and Luke 21. In Matthew 24 specifically, they say, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Okay. So this specific part is really only in Matthew, which is fascinating. And Matthew is the one that just really goes and elaborates quite a bit. But they ask a couple questions here. When will this happen? What's the sign and the end of the age, right? And so I just want to kind of highlight that because Jesus goes through and specifically now, and you'll see this repeated, starts giving you all these things to look for, not you, I'll clarify that. Go look for the earthquakes, right? Kingdom against kingdom, right? You're going to see wars, rumors of wars, wickedness will increase, And a lot of folks look for these signs, and there's so many actually described here. I mean, it'd be a lot to really get into it. Maybe we'll look at a few more. The sign of Daniel, right? Because Daniel prophesied there'd be a 7-year period at which there's going to be the destruction of the temple, right? That's important. And that's why people sometimes will talk about a 7-year tribulation right after the rapture. And he says, look for these signs to take place and look for people to try to deceive you. Right? The coming of the Son of Man is going to come quickly, but there will be a lot of signs of his coming. Now, this is very important. Jesus is saying, look for this, signs of the Son of Man in heaven, like they're actually heavenly signs. He's going to send angels and all this different stuff. And then he says, now learn this lesson from the fig tree. Even so, when you see all these things, know that it's near, right at the door. So he's saying, look at all these signs. Look at all these signs, guys. We want to make sure you know when this coming is going to happen and Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. This is very important. And then Jesus says something completely off the charts. If you've been trying to look for these signs in recent history, truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Wait a minute, Jesus. Did you just say all this stuff's going to happen to that generation? Yes, he did. And not only did he say this here, but he says it again in Mark and he says it again in Luke. At this exact point in the conversation, he says, certainly this generation will not pass away before these things take place. I'm going to give you another one too. We'll look at Mark and Luke here in a second. Matthew 23, before he gets into the talk of the temple and the war and all that stuff that's going to happen, he is going after the religious leaders, right? He goes and he does all these woes, judgments, and he basically just says, you guys are terrible. You're robbing the people. You're putting burdens on the people. Sorry, I'm really summarizing here. You can go back and read. And he says, the judgment that's coming on you is going to be serious. You brood of vipers, you bunch of snakes. You're going to see some really bad stuff happen to you. And at the end of that passage in Matthew 23, he is specifically, hitting up the current religious leaders of the day that are not only about to try to get Jesus killed, but leading the people away from their Messiah, right? So pretty bad. He says, truly, I tell you, all this will come on this generation. So we see this phrase not just in Matthew 24, we see it in Matthew 23, because Jesus is trying to make really clear that this thing that's going to happen, which is all this bad stuff, is going to happen to this generation, right? The generation that was really responsible for killing Jesus, the generation that was still owed some punishment from God based on Old Testament law. And so Jesus is trying to make really clear that judgment is coming on that generation. Okay, just so you can see it, a few other places. We're going to jump into Mark 13. Same thing as Matthew 24. What's going to happen? The temple's going to be destroyed. And they ask him, what will be the sign that all these things are about to be fulfilled, right? Same question. Although, again, Mark doesn't elaborate on the second question they asked, more or less, which is, what's the coming of the end of the age, right? Because Mark doesn't really go into much detail there. Again, look out for signs, look out for signs, look out for signs. Keep going, keep going. It's going to be bad. And then the same thing is said right here. Truly, I tell you that this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So there it is, all these, and he does go on. We're going to actually look at this, probably just go back to Matthew to look at this. Mark doesn't talk much more. Mark kind of just, stops there and just says, actually, there will be some more stuff that's going to happen. We'll talk about that because Jesus is still coming back in the future, right? But there was a sort of coming of Jesus that was going to be pretty universally serious, in tribulation, Jerusalem being destroyed, temple being destroyed, bad stuff, and he says, but there's tons of signs, guys. You're going to know when this is happening. Okay, Luke 21, and then we'll kind of jump into the second part of Luke 24. You got to see the same thing, right? And this one, it begins with the widow's offering, which is great. Temple's going to be torn down. What's going to be the sign that this is about to take place, right? So again, Luke kind of shortens the conversation and says, all I really want to talk about is the temple being destroyed, because that's, if you're an Israelite living in the first century, that would be a huge deal. That would be a huge devastation for you, right? So again, this is the stuff you're hearing people talk about often in the media: earthquakes, famines, pestilence, right? Look at this earthquake. Look at this thing. Look at this thing that happened and how it's a sign of the times, stand firm. And let me just show you this. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, those of you in Judea, flee to the mountains, right? This is such a specific warning for such a specific group of people. Spoiler alert here. Within 40 years, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. But it is actually first surrounded by a Roman army, by Vespasian, and then he has to go back because there's lots of political upheaval and lots of complicated things happening during this time for the Romans as well as Israel. So there's actually a time period in the first century, early in the 7-year war that the Romans did against the Israelites, where Jerusalem gets totally surrounded, and then Vespasian has to leave, and then Titus eventually comes back and does what is prophesied here, which was terrible and devastating. So again, there's this, Jesus is saying something over and over again. Look out for these signs, my followers, look out for these signs so that you don't get stuck in Jerusalem, which was really the center of the church until for 30, 40 years after Jesus died, sending out missionaries, doing all this stuff. But he's like, at a certain point, you guys got to get out of here because bad things are coming. So again, we get to the same part in this prophecy. This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So I know I'm banging the same drum over and over again, but we see it twice in Matthew, once in Mark, once in Luke, all within this context. This is the stuff people get really bent out of shape about. I mean, you can go on YouTube and find people talking about secret government meetings and alliances being made and things that are going on all the time. And this earthquake is a sign that the rapture is about to happen. And Jesus just said so clearly over and over again. And actually, most of the church outside of America, especially, and a lot of people in America, we sort of collectively roll our eyes and say, yeah, we're not really looking for this stuff anymore because Jesus said this was going to specifically happen to that generation of followers, right? And that's who needed to look out. Okay, so do I think Jesus has already then come back and there is no future coming of Jesus? No. And let's kind of dive in again. In Matthew 24, Matthew kind of goes into this whole question, right? And the end of the age. What's the sign of the temple being destroyed and the end of the age? They ask sort of a twofold question, and Jesus gives a twofold answer. We've already looked at the first half of the answer. For some of you, this was good enough. For some of you, you're like, listen, Jesus said this whole thing was going to happen in the first century. Great. For the rest of you that are like, okay, I'm super curious now, let's keep going. We'll do that, right? So again, this is the part we kind of got to. Heaven and earth will pass away. My words won't pass away. This generation. Now, I think it's really interesting because then Jesus makes this phrase. He makes it in Mark. He makes it in Luke too, by the way. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. I want to highlight this because we do believe that there's going to be, and Revelation talks about this a little bit, sort of an end of the current era. Like there's a new heaven, new earth. There's a bunch of stuff that's still supposed to happen. And Jesus kind of says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. And then he says, but about that day and hour, no one knows, not the angels, not the Son, but only the Father. And what Jesus begins to talk about here is that he's going to come in this above section in a judgment, right? And he's going to come and do all this stuff to Jerusalem, Judea, and the whole area. And this is what people get really bent out of shape for. And then he proceeds to over and over again say, I'm going to come another time. And how do I know that this is another coming of the Son of Man? Because he will go and will say over and over again that there's no sign. And you'll see this not just in Matthew 24, but in Matthew 25, that there will be no sign of this coming, right? I was actually asked by one of my coworkers this week. She said, I'm seeing all this crazy stuff online about the rapture and it happening and things like that. What do you think? And I was able to kind of come right here and show this and say, listen, there was something that happened where God came in judgment against the Israelites and those who rejected Jesus especially. And that all happened in the first century. There was literally a 7-year war that took place from 66 to 73 AD. In the middle of that war, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Old Testament covenant was, basically cut off, finalized. The book of Hebrews alludes to this, that the Old Testament law was sort of passing away and would soon be totally removed because, again, they had all these prophecies that Jesus mentioned. And by the way, there's incredible first century accounts from early church fathers that talk about, because of the warnings of Jesus, very few to no Christians, early believers in Jesus, actually fell in the downfall of Jerusalem and Judea when the Romans were for 7 years attacking the Israelites. Now, there were many that the Romans persecuted, and, especially through the 60s, through Nero, through a very terrible time. But those who listened to Jesus, and even though they were in Jerusalem and Judea and kind of going out and operating the church from that area for a very long time, when they started to see these signs, they knew it was time to get out of Dodge. It was time to get out of Jerusalem and go flee to the mountains, which is exactly what they did. The church, basically head of the church, like relocated to a place called Pella, and the Christians didn't get wiped out like many of the Jews got wiped out in this time. So I just want to talk now, and now you're getting a little bonus material here. I mean, I really kind of started with the question of, is the rapture happening right now? Should we look for signs? The answer to that question is no. But I just want to highlight now in this passage, right? There is a day or hour that Jesus will come that's completely unknown, right? He even says he doesn't know, and that's hard for us to reconcile sometimes. Even Jesus is saying, I don't know. It'll be like the days of Noah, right? People are eating and drinking in marriage, and they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them away, right? And you're going to see this because he says there's a day or hour that you will not know, but the Lord will come, and it'll be like a thief in the night, right? You've probably heard that phrase before. It's like a thief in the night. Do you know when a thief is coming to rob your house? No. So there's all this language about, keeping watch, but what he's saying, ironically, is there's a kind of thing that's going to happen in the first part of Matthew 24 where there'll be sign. And then there's going to be this sort of other coming of God where there's not going to be signs. And so you're just supposed to kind of keep watch. You're supposed to be a faithful and wise servant, right? You need to be a good steward of what God has put you in charge of during this time period that I believe we're in right now, where we just have no idea when Jesus is going to come back to earth, right? So could it have happened this week? Absolutely. Would it have happened this week considering everybody was, predicting that? Probably not, because nobody actually knows when it's going to happen. And by the way, Matthew especially goes into this in detail, and even into Matthew 25, right? He begins to tell all these parables of how you need to act as if God could come back at any time, right? Live a life where you hold a righteous standard because you don't know when the bridegroom is going to come, right? That's this first parable. You need to have your oil and have your lamps ready to go because the bridegroom can come at any time. There's parables of bags of gold, very similar to talents and minas parables, right? Which you've probably heard before, where you need to be a good steward, right? You don't know when the master's going to come back. So whatever he's given you now, be a good steward of. And then it even goes on to talk about then the separation of the sheep and the goats, which is sort of the final judgment that's going to happen. Now, I just want to make sure you notice, in case you haven't, nowhere in this passage, right? Nowhere after that kind of stopping point in Matthew 24 does Jesus say this will happen to this generation, right? So he's saying, I'm still coming and there's still work for me to do, but this one, the end of the age, you're not going to know when that's going to happen, right? You're very distinctly not going to know. He gets down to the end of this passage and he talks about sort of last of all, when you see somebody who's a stranger, who's thirsty, who needs help them, and you're helping me. And he says, there is an end of the edge. There's a final judgment that will finally take place. But we are very, very distinctly, and you see this through these parables, unaware of when this is going to happen, right? So Matthew 24, almost until the end of Matthew 24, signs, look out for this. This will all happen to this generation, right? And if you want to go and read books like The Last Days According to Jesus or Victorious Eschatology, these folks represent what is often commonly called the partial preterist position. And in this position, we say preterist just sort of meaning already fulfilled. That's what we believe as partial preterist. We believe that some of what Jesus prophesied was already fulfilled, but certainly not all of it. We don't think that Jesus has come back and it's the end of the age and the sheep and the goats have been judged and that's it. There's nothing else. We believe Jesus is coming back. But we believe there's a very distinct break in the prophecies of Jesus where he says, this stuff happens to this generation, and then this stuff happens and you're not going to know when it's happening, right? You won't be able to predict it. There are no signs. Just be a good steward. Just be a faithful bride waiting for the bridegroom to come in the last days. So I think right there, if you're still with me, you've been drinking from a fire hose and you have learned a lot of, I think, great information that will hopefully help you to realize that when the church or the news or people get really wound up spiritually about the signs of the times, this is actually stuff that the first century church was warned about, that needed to be aware of. And you even see it through the book of Acts, right? You notice how folks in Jerusalem, when they really first became converts, they started selling all their property and their goods and their houses. I don't know if you've ever felt terrible about that when you read through those passages about the early church. Well, keep in mind that was happening very specifically in Jerusalem, right? Why would the early church followers sell all their goods? It's not because they were better Christians than us necessarily. It was because they knew that Jerusalem and Judea were going to be destroyed. That's what Jesus had prophesied. And so it doesn't make sense to try to keep property in Jerusalem if you know that within your generation, all this stuff is going to get wiped out anyway, right? So you see even that through the book of Acts, that folks believed what Jesus said, Jerusalem would be destroyed within their generation. And go back and read the history. And it's a terrible account. It's a 7-year bloody, awful war that happens between the Romans and the Israelites during that time. But it fulfilled all the promises of God, of these judgments, of this tribulation that sometimes people think is still to come. We don't need to celebrate when Israel gets into its next war. We don't need to get excited about earthquakes and famines, guys. All that stuff, even though it still happens today, the promises of Jesus were fulfilled around those things. So now what we look for is we look for Jesus to return at a day and an hour we don't know when it's going to happen. So live as if he could come back at any moment. But if you're trying to predict it, you're one of probably hundreds or thousands of folks who have tried to do that based on signs that Jesus said many, many years ago. This stuff will happen to that generation, not our generation. So thanks so much. Have a good one.